The people of Allenton weren't perfect. Like many council estates across Britain, it had its problems. It had its arguments, its struggles, its stories. The kind of place where everybody knows somebody and everybody has an opinion. But it was also just a community, a place where people went to work, where children played outside, where neighbors lived alongside each other and carried on with their everyday lives. Because the truth is, most people who grow up on streets like these will never see anything beyond the ordinary. Nothing on the streets of Derby, anywhere in England, came close to what Mick Philpott did.
So, who was Mick Philpott? If you asked the people who knew him, you'd probably get a different answer every time. To some, he was confident, charismatic, the loudest man in the room. To others, he was manipulative, controlling, and obsessed with sex, attention, and power. By 2012, Philpott was living with his wife Mairead and their 6 children in a modest council house on Victory Road in Derby. But his life was anything but ordinary. Mick openly pursued relationships with other women, often while Mairead remained at home caring for the children. His personal life revolved around complicated relationships, constant drama, and a need to be the center of attention. In fact, just a few years before the events of this case, Mick Philpott appeared on the Jeremy Kyle Show. At the time, it seemed like another sensational daytime television episode. In hindsight, it feels very different. We'll come back to that. But first, we need to understand the people around him. Mairead Philpott was, in many ways, the complete opposite of Mick. Where he sought attention, she largely stayed out of the spotlight. Friends and relatives often described her as quiet and devoted to her children. She spent most of her time caring for the family, while Mick's increasingly chaotic personal life unfolded around her. The couple's relationship was unusual and, by many accounts, heavily dominated by Mick. He controlled much of what happened within the household, while Mairead remained by his side despite the constant turmoil. Together, they were raising 6 young children at their home on Victory Road. But they weren't the only people at the center of this story. To understand what happened next, we need to look at another woman in Mick Philpott's life. Lisa Willis wasn't just Mick Philpott's former partner. For a time, she lived with Mick and Mairead in a caravan parked beside the family home. It was an unconventional arrangement, with Mick maintaining relationships with both women while they lived only a few meters apart. During that time, Lisa had several children with Mick, adding another layer to an already complex family dynamic. But by 2011, Lisa had had enough. She left the caravan, took her children with her, and began building a life away from Mick's influence. Her departure marked the beginning of a bitter dispute over custody. Mick wanted the children to return. Lisa refused. The final person we need to introduce is Paul Mosley. Mosley was a friend of Mick and Mairead Philpott and was a regular presence around the family in the months leading up to 2012. He wasn't a relative, but he had become closely connected to the couple and was familiar with their day-to-day lives. As the events surrounding the Philpotts unfolded, Paul Mosley would find himself drawn into the center of the story, alongside Mick and Mairead. We'll come back to Paul later. What followed was a growing conflict that would eventually become one of the central threads in an investigation. By the spring of 2012, the relationship between Mick and Lisa had deteriorated beyond repair. In 2011, Mick Philpott and Lisa Willis appeared on the Jeremy Kyle Show. Their relationship, their family life, and their ongoing disputes were laid bare in front of a studio audience.
You don't work?
Oh, yes, I do work.
Yeah, I know your argument on this. Just give it to us. You say I look after my kids. What's wrong with a man looking after his kids other than a woman?
That's correct. What is wrong with a man looking after his children? I mean, I'm old-fashioned. I believe the man should be at work, but unfortunately, because the media keeps putting this certain story in the paper, I cannot get a job.
You can't get a job because of what?
Criminal record.
See.
I said, you do,
Why
mate.
are you so
I will
defensive?
be. Because when it comes to my kids, I'm very, very
I've just
defensive.
complimented your kids!
After I had a go at you.
I just said that
Listen,
ever
just
since...
get out, just talk to that, pal. Talk.
Did you notice something Mick Philpott said?
You can't get a job because of what?
Criminal record.
See.
I said, you do,
Why
mate.
are you so
I will
defensive?
be. Because when it comes to my...
So, why did Mick Philpott have a criminal record? The answer takes us back more than 30 years. In 1978, after his teenage girlfriend tried to end their relationship, Philpott broke into her home and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times. When her mother tried to intervene, she was attacked too. Philpott was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 7 years in prison. It was a violent attack that revealed a pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior, long before the events that would make his name known across Britain. When that episode of The Jeremy Kyle Show aired, very few people watching at home would have known any of that. To most viewers, it was just another piece of daytime television. Another family argument, another spectacle, something to watch over a cup of tea before moving on with the rest of the day. Nobody watching could have known that the darkest chapter of Mick Philpott's life was still to come. And in just a few months' time, events in Derby would shock the entire country. In the early hours of Friday, May the 11th, 2012, Victory Road in Derby was quiet. For most people living there, it was just another night. Inside one of the houses on the street was the Philpott family. At this moment, nobody on Victory Road knew anything was wrong. Nobody outside that house could see what was happening inside. Then, in the early hours of the morning, everything changed. A fire had started inside the Philpott family home. According to the account given by Mick Philpott, he woke to discover the house filling with smoke. He would later say he tried to reach his children, but the fire had already taken hold. As the flames spread through the property, neighbors began waking to the sound of commotion outside. By the time firefighters reached the property, it was already too late. Mick and Mairead Philpott had escaped the fire, but their 6 children remained inside the home. Despite the efforts of the emergency services, none of the children survived. They were 13-year-old Dwayne, 9-year-old Jade, 8-year-old Jesse, 7-year-old Jaden, 6-year-old Jack, and 5-year-old John. The news sent shockwaves through Derby and across the country. A family home on an ordinary street had become the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. And in the days that followed, Mick Philpott would present himself to the public as a grieving father who had lost everything. In the days after the fire, Mick Philpott became the face of the tragedy. With the children gone and his home, he spoke publicly about the loss of his children.
Helping us to cope with what's going on. And then there's a young lad called Daniel Stevenson who tried to get in the house, the same as myself, Joe across the road, and the Butler brothers. And of course, there's the poor firemen, the police, and the ambulances, the doctors, the nurses, literally everybody who tried to help save our children, they couldn't. Just excuse me a minute. Have you had enough? We've decided that through our son Dwayne, and unfortunately the last one to pass away, that we're going to donate his organs to save another child.
To those watching across the country, he appeared to be a father in unimaginable pain. The story seemed clear. A family had been torn apart by a devastating house fire, and 2 parents were left grieving the loss of their 6 children. Tributes poured in. Flowers were placed outside the property. The community came together to support a family that appeared to have suffered the worst loss imaginable. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning their work. And as they started looking closer at what had happened, inside the house on Victory Road, questions began to emerge. At first, the fire was treated as a tragic accident. But as investigators examined the scene, they began to find evidence that suggested something far more deliberate. The fire had not started naturally. A trail of petrol had been discovered inside the property, leading police to question whether this was an accident at all. The focus of the investigation began to change. The grieving father, who had appeared on television, was now at the center of a murder inquiry. As detectives continued to piece together what had happened that night, they started examining the timeline, the evidence and the accounts given by those inside the house. Slowly, the story presented to the public began to fall apart. What had first appeared to be a tragic house fire was now being investigated as something much more sinister, and the person at the center of that investigation was Mick Philpott. As detectives continued investigating the fire, they began looking more closely at the events of that night. The accounts given by Mick, Mairead and Paul Mosley were examined alongside the physical evidence recovered from the house. The question investigators needed to answer was simple. Was this a tragic accident, or had someone deliberately started the fire? The discovery of petrol inside the property changed everything. Police now believed the fire had been started deliberately, and the case became a murder investigation. On May 12th, just one day after the fire, Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and Paul Mosley were arrested on suspicion of murder. The story that had shocked the country was changing. The people who had appeared to be grieving parents were now suspects in the deaths of 6 children. After the arrests, investigators began piecing together the events that led to the fire. The focus was no longer just on how the blaze started, but why. Police believed the fire had been deliberately set, and they began examining the evidence that surrounded the family home. One of the key areas of the investigation was the claim that the fire had been started as part of a plan to create sympathy, while also attempting to frame the events as an outside attack on the family. Investigators looked at the movements of those involved, the accounts they had given, and the evidence recovered from the scene. As the case developed, police argued that the story given by Mick Philpott did not match the evidence they had uncovered. The investigation began to reveal a very different picture from the one the public had first seen. In 2013, Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and Paul Mosley went on trial at Nottingham Crown Court. The prosecution argued that the fire was not an accident, but a planned act carried out to gain sympathy and to damage Lisa Willis, who was involved in an ongoing dispute with Mick over access to their children. The court heard that petrol had been used to start the fire and that the events of that night had been carefully examined by investigators. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who wanted to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. Mick Philpott denied murder and claimed he had tried to save his children. During the trial, the jury heard evidence from the police investigation, forensic experts, and those connected to the family. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its verdict. Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and Paul Mosley were all found guilty of manslaughter. Mick Philpott was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 15 years. Mairead Philpott and Paul Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years in prison.
The conviction of Mick Philpott brought an end to one of the most shocking criminal cases Britain had seen in years. For the people of Derby, especially those living around Victory Road, the events of May 2012 left a lasting mark. A street that had once been ordinary had become known across the country for a tragedy that nobody living there could have imagined. The case also raised wider questions about the way Mick Philpott had presented himself to the public. The man who had once appeared on daytime television, who had become a familiar face through interviews and headlines, was now remembered for something far darker. The footage from the Jeremy Kyle show was no longer viewed as simply a family dispute playing out on television. Looking back, many people saw it as an insight into the personality of a man whose actions would later shock the nation. The 6 children at the center of this story were the ones who lost everything. Duane, Jade, Jesse, Jaden, Jack, and John were remembered by their family, their community, and those who followed the case. Beyond the headlines, beyond the court case, and beyond the man whose name became infamous, this remains a story about 6 children whose lives ended far too soon. As always, thanks for watching.